Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hope you're doing well. So, the RadFems, I have often spoken about how there's this bisexuality, lesbianism, and hatred of heterosexuality in women amongst the RadFems. And I think it's really important for Muslim women across the world to understand what is the agenda of the RadFems and where their reasoning and bitterness is coming from. Okay, so I have my notes here and I want to make sure I read it as promptly as possible and distinctly how I wrote it. So, RadFems criticize heterosexuality as a social institution because it reinforces patriarchal control due to how it ties a woman's worth to relationships with men. Now, you may be wondering, what are you talking about? Well, think about how when a woman has slept with like 50 guys, her status goes down in worth because she's had more relationships with men. So the more she slept around, the less worth she has. And the more pure she is, more clean, and, less loose, we'll argue, like loosey-goosey, she's not a hood rat, she's gonna have more value. Okay? Now, they glorify lesbianism. They argue that heterosexuality is a political institution that subordinates women by making them wives and mothers. They argue further that heterosexuality isn't a natural choice, and I'd argue that many women are actually heterosexual, the majority, and that our desire to have children from men we like is another refutation of their philosophy, because you look at the domestic violence rate within lesbian relationships, it's quite high, and the divorce rate amongst lesbians, okay, compared to heterosexual couples. And surrogacy is an institution that needs to be banned, but lesbians will get surrogates, they will use sperm bank donors. I used to think sperm bank donors was okay, but then I realized that's a really flawed logic. They won't have children with a simp, and they do abortions when they get pregnant by a guy that they decided to mate with, but then this faceless person who they don't know their morals, their bad traits, they're gonna carry his kid. That doesn't really make any sense to me. A stranger who they never got to have a cup of coffee with, they're gonna put their body and continue their lineage. Versus, someone they met in person. I always found that to be quite odd. And it's still strange to me that lesbians would want to get pregnant when that requires a male. And it also is quite confusing when they buy items in the shape of male organs in order to use that as a tool for pleasure. It's like, I thought you hated men. I mean, wouldn't you hate their mechanisms, their gear as well? There's a lot that doesn't make sense. And so, when you look at how, they talk on their threads, you'll see a lot of them lamenting how they're attracted to what they call moids. They call men moids. And you'll see reinforced lesbianism. I'll see oftentimes girls say, women, oh, I'm about to go on a date with the guy, I really don't want to do anything. I feel such like trash. Men are trash. I don't even know why I'm going through with this. And then you'll see these people come in the comments about, you shouldn't. And it's often very ugly, butch-looking women. I had a cousin named Tasha who was a lesbian. She was butch and she dressed like a guy. And she seemed to always have problems in her relationships with women. And it was very troubling for her growing up. And so I think about the violence rate amongst the lesbians often, because a lot of women assume that because two women are with each other, that somehow means they're going to be like unicorns and roses everywhere. And in reality, it's actually more violence. I was thinking about, I often do deep introspection, I don't shy away from that. And I thought, I'm not a lesbian, but if I was, and a woman was talking back to me, because we're both women, I might hit. you know, because I used to fight a lot, and I probably would be stronger, or at least the odds would be more even. And I thought, that's interesting. But I have hit men and men have hit me. But I know a man is stronger, so I will restrain myself more. One should restrain themselves because of respect. But when someone pisses you off, I don't know, it's almost like you're more willing to hit. Just like men, gay men will hit each other, you know, before they hit a woman. So I just think about that a lot. It's not, you know, it's less risky to hit a fellow woman than it is to hit a man, you know. Now, another thing is that they want women to have more platonic and romantic relationships with one another, and not to be dependent upon men, but to be dependent on women. So, like lesbian compounds. And I thought that was quite strange, but I have noticed this pattern. And so, when you see feminism rising up, the RadFems, who's leading it is often Western lesbians and Western bisexuals. And it's really fascinating. I saw a funny meme by Stone Comics, which was like, it's a little white looking balloon character guy. I don't know. It's called Stone Comics, I think. And a woman was like, when she's in her prime, she says she's bisexual, but then when she hits 30, she's like grabbing a man's pants saying, "Get me pregnant." And so it kind of just shows how some women think they're bisexual because they have a tendency to get wild when they have intoxicants and stuff, but then when it comes down to sobriety and biology, they crave a child, and then their like view of men changes. So I found that to be quite interesting. I often, and some women, there was a joke by a comedian said that some women think they're bisexual just because they kissed a hot woman at a concert. And then you think of Katy Perry's song, "I kissed a girl and I liked it," like how they push it on the youth, and then it makes them kind of a little bit like, well, which way do I go, you know? And so it's a whole hodgepodge of conversation, and I took a class on human sexuality, and it's really quite weird, to be honest. But I have noticed this pattern that the lesbians really want to take down the patriarchy by attempting to make some women reject men. And what's odd is that they don't really realize that polygamy will just make a bounce back. You're gonna have all these men who, let's say they lose their women to lesbianism. Well, they're just gonna work, and the cream of the crop will get to reproduce, usually. And the women who are left that are heterosexual will just share a good man, and I don't think that lesbianism will decrease any type of birth rate, to be honest with you, because it's fascinating. You see cases of women doing things with each other when they're on drugs or when they're drunk. And I'm not denying the lesbians' existence, but I am just saying that when push comes to shove, if we studied the data, women fooling around with women is a lot different than women marrying women and committing to that till death do them part, right? So, you know. And also I noticed that the women, they'll be claim to be bisexual. If they cheat on their husband with a woman, he's a lot more forgiving than if it was with a man. And so that kind of shows that they're trying to have both their hands in the cookie jar. You know, it's a whole uncomfortable, awkward conversation. But when RadFems claim that heterosexuality isn't a natural choice, I'm just thinking about reproduction and how you couldn't have that without men. And that if a woman wanted a baby, you know, 300 years ago, and she's a lesbian, she's going to have to engage with a man in order to do that. And so, you know, the fact that she's able to go through with it with a man kind of shows that she's not really a lesbian. I think that if you were a lesbian, you'd be utterly disgusted by men, and you couldn't even stand touching them. But again, there's a lot of gay men who they still lie and have relationships with women, so you would call them bisexual, you know, but they're able to lie to the woman and still marry her in order to hide their gayness and make her life horrible because she doesn't realize she married a gay man, and their bedroom life is horrible because he's disgusted by the female form. And so it's an interesting phenomenon amongst the RadFems how they feel that heterosexuality is a political force that subjugates women and ties their value to men. You know, because when you really look at it, a woman's value can go down with the more men she slept with. And some men will say, no, I'll date the neighborhood skank. But I think if that man has a good mom, they don't want him to bring home someone who serviced half of Dubai, right? That'd be heartbreaking. And now that I have a son, I would be mortified if he brought home something so depraved and low. And now, I think when you really love your male offspring, your male family members, you should have a more mature, honest shift, where you're like, you know what, I hope he gets a virgin, and then it changes. Now there are some more occultic type of creepy moms who are like, no, son, go wife up that stripper, because they don't have any type of protection over their offspring. But I'd argue that that is a minority. And so, yes, a woman's value can be tied to relationships with men, because it kind of shows how easy she is. Wasn't that in Peaky Blinders? There's a scene where a guy gets with a really lewd woman who's used to servicing men, and then the main character tries to bribe her with money to prove she hasn't changed, and she gets ready to accept the money to have relations with the main character and cheat on her man that she's about to marry, So this hints a lot to, as Tupac said, you can't turn a hoe into a housewife. It's very difficult to do that, right? And before a Christian says it, oh, he without sin, cast the first stone, ha, and rise and sin no more. So they always leave that part out. Rise and sin no more. So if a woman's out there being the town rodent, just giving it out, spreading STDs, making it easier for men to cheat on their wives, well, we would say that's bad, don't do that, and you have a lower value, and you're not a good person. So our value as human beings can go down with the way we treat our coworkers, our neighbors, nature even, like if you're always polluting and stuff. So our social capital rises and falls through many factors, not just men, but because the patriarchal system, I'd argue, does value decent women, and everyone wants to marry a top woman, then it makes sense. So let me know what you think. It's an interesting thing that they fight against heterosexuality a lot and seek to destroy heterosexual relationships and encourage lesbianism amongst our ranks. I've noticed this for quite some time. And I've even seen them switch back and forth. It's like the accounts don't even, they think people don't have a memory. Like 1 minute I've seen some say that they're lesbians, the next they say they're divorced. Which is it? Some say they're a mom, some say they don't have kids. They just make it up as they go along. It's like cosplay for them online. So it's fascinating that these are the people trying to lead a movement online. So when you're talking to a Muslim woman who might be influenced by feminism, especially radical feminism, RadFems, just let her know that that's a lesbian movement more often than not. Let me know what you think. Please like, comment, subscribe, share, join the blog.